Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 2 on Biology and Psychology. This is actually an exciting topic because technology is really allowing us to understand better the intersection of biology and psychology. Through brain scans, imaging, we're able to see and understand more about how our biology affects our behavior and our emotions. And so this is a pretty rapidly growing area. And having a good understanding of biology is essential for psychology because we really need to understand what motivates human behavior. And sometimes it is something organic that can be managed with medical interventions. Or sometimes we do need to look at therapy and look at other type of assistance to help people with emotions. So it's really understanding how the brain's working, our hormones, is important when we're looking at psychology. Now with this chapter, I know some of y'all may be familiar with the material. Some of you all may not understand it that well yet, but our goal is for you to understand it better. This chapter, it's a lot of memorization, and there's just no getting around it. Sometimes we just have to memorize things. And so understanding the brain and understanding hormones and how the body works, the central nervous system, all of that simply just takes some memorization. So we have a lot of activities in MindTap for you to complete. I have some supplemental videos in the module for you to watch. I'm giving you 2 weeks to go over this material so that you feel like you have time to dedicate to it and to learn it. And so I encourage you to make the most of this time. Now, part of what we're studying is neurons and how they function. And I was in a training with Dr. Kenneth Carter, and he explained neurons in a very good way, I thought. And so I wanted you to hear his explanation because sometimes it's just better or nicer to hear from somebody besides me. And so there is a video of him explaining neurons located in the module. So go ahead and watch that first and then come back to me in this video and we'll continue on with the chapter. Okay, so at the end of Dr. Carter's video, he was talking about neurotransmitters, and he discussed that when neurons fire, neurotransmitters are released. However, neurons won't fire unless the incoming messages combine to reach a certain strength, and that's defined as the threshold at which neurons will fire. So every time a neuron fires, it transmits an impulse of the same strength. And this is known as the all or nothing principle. So neurons fire more often when they have been stimulated by a large number of other neurons. And the refractory period is the period of recovery time between the firings. So Dr. Carter also talked about the synapse, and this is when a neuron relays its message to another neuron. This occurs in the synapse. And the synapse contains an axon terminal from the transmitting neuron, a dendrite or the body of the receiving neuron, and a fluid-filled gap between the two that is called the synaptic cleft. Now the messages sent between neurons are sent through neurotransmitters. These are chemical messengers, and they take the message through the neural impulse from one neuron to another. So the receptor site is the dendrite on the receiving neuron that's tailored to receive the message through the neurotransmitters. And there's several types of neurotransmitters that you need to be familiar with. Oftentimes when people are having issues, it could be physical issues, it could be emotional issues, it can be related to the neurotransmitters. And so medication can be given to help regulate how the neurotransmitters are functioning. I want you to just be a little bit familiar with different types of neurotransmitters. Don't worry so much about studying them and memorizing everything about them, but just be somewhat familiar with what they are responsible for. ACH is a neurotransmitter that controls muscle contractions. It's prevalent in the hippocampus. It's a structure in the brain involved with the formation of memories. So when the amount of ACH available decreases in the brain, then memory formation is impaired, and that often happens with people with Alzheimer's. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that acts in the brain and it affects the ability to perceive pleasure, voluntary movement, learning, and memory. And so deficiencies in dopamine are related to Parkinson's and also schizophrenia. Norepinephrine is produced largely by neurons in the brainstem, and it acts as both a neurotransmitter and as a hormone. It's involved with arousal, learning, and memory, and eating, and deficiencies in this neurotransmitter has been linked to mood disorders. The serotonin transmitter is involved with emotional arousal and sleep, and deficiencies of this neurotransmitter have been linked to eating disorders, alcoholism, depression, aggression, and insomnia. The GABA neurotransmitter is involved with anxiety, and it can help calm anxious reactions, and deficiencies in this neurotransmitter are linked to depression. And lastly, endorphin seems to be the one that most people know about because we have heard about runner's high, and when people run a lot, they get a surge of endorphins or exercise a lot. So endorphins inhibit pain and increase a sense of competence. It can enhance the functioning of the immune system, and it's similar to the narcotic morphine, having that similar type of effect. So you can see how if there's deficiencies in these neurotransmitters, medication can be used to help manage them so that people who are struggling with depression or people who are struggling with anxiety can have medication to help level out their neurotransmitters so they don't struggle so much with different emotions that are impairing their daily living. So let's now look at the nervous system. The nervous system is divided into two parts: the central nervous system, consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, consisting of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, and both of those are divided even more. The somatic nervous system transmits messages about sight, sound, smells, temperature, body positions, and so forth to the central nervous system. So the messages are sent from the brain and the spinal cord to the somatic nervous system to control purposeful body movements. So if I want to raise my hand, then a message is sent to allow me the ability to raise my hand. The autonomic nervous system also has different types of neurons that regulate the glands and the muscles of the internal organs. So this nervous system controls activities such as the heartbeat, respiration, digestion, and dilation of the pupils. It has two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. This chart kind of simplifies, but it shows how the two different nervous systems are divided. And so, in general, the sympathetic part of the nervous system is involved with your fight or flight response. So think about if you're really anxious, or think about if you're afraid of something. All that happens to your body to prepare you to either fight or to run away. That's the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic part is more active when you're trying to replenish your energy, such as eating, such as resting. So think of the parasympathetic as more your resting and rejuvenation state, and your sympathetic nervous system is when you're using up your energy needed for certain times when maybe you have to protect yourself or you're feeling fear. Even if you're having to give a speech in front of a class, your sympathetic nervous system will probably kick into gear because you start worrying, your heart might start beating, you might have sweaty palms because you have some type of fear of what might happen when you're making this speech. Whereas if you're just sitting in class and you're listening to someone else make a speech, your parasympathetic nervous system is probably in control because you don't have to worry about anything. You can just sit there and relax and listen to somebody else give the speech. Now, the central nervous system consists of the spinal cord and the brain. Now, the spinal cord is the true information highway because it transmits messages from sensory receptors to the brain and from the brain to the muscles and the glands throughout our body. The spinal reflex is an unlearned response to stimulus that may require only two neurons, a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. So if you start getting cold, you're taking in that information that it's cold, and then your body might start shivering to try to warm you up. This is all the neurons that are being transmitted with the spinal cord. Also in the central nervous system, we have the brain. Now, we understand the brain through different ways. One could be experimenting with the brain. So if somebody has some type of brain damage, we're able to assess the type of damage that occurred. Either it's from accidents or from disease, and we can learn more about the brain and how it's functioning. Also, research involves intentionally damaging parts of the brain in animals to try to learn more about the brain functioning. And I understand that's controversial. A lot of people don't approve of that, but that is some of the experimentation that does occur. And also we can use electrical probes to stimulate parts of the brain to see how the brain reacts to different types of stimuli. An EEG helps us record the natural electrical activity of the brain, and it detects brain waves that pass between electrodes placed on the scalp. We now predominantly use imaging techniques that use a computer's ability to generate images of the parts of the brain from the sources of radiation. And the three types of techniques that we use are CAT scans, PET scans, and MRIs. And these show us maybe parts of the brains that have been damaged, differences between healthy brains and diseased brains. And I've seen images of people that are obese versus people that are not, and you can see the actual differences in their brain based on their lifestyle. There's differences in brains between drug addicts and those who don't use drugs, between those that have autism and those that do not. And so these scans allow us to really see those differences and have a better understanding of how the brain works. Now, this is the part of the chapter that you're just going to have to work on memorization. It's important that you have a basic understanding of the parts of the brain and what they're responsible for. So look at this chart, look at the information in your text, the activities that you have to do, and the supplemental videos that are in the module. I'm not going to spend time going through each of these parts because, again, this is something that you can just review and learn on your own. I do want to emphasize, though, the structure of the cerebral cortex, because only in humans does the cerebrum make up such a large part of the brain. This is really what separates us from other mammals. And the cerebrum is responsible for thinking and language. The surface of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex, and it's wrinkled with ridges and valleys. And the valleys in the cortex are called fissures. And a key fissure almost divides the cerebrum in half, creating two hemispheres that we often refer to as the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The hemispheres are also connected by the corpus callosum, and that is a bundle of about 200 million nerve fibers. You also have in the cerebral cortex the different lobes of the brain: the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the last to develop. It continues developing until about 25 years of age. The frontal lobe is involved with our executive functioning, our thinking, our planning, our impulse control, and this is why we always encourage teenagers to not drink or use drugs, because that interferes with the healthy development of the frontal lobe. You also need to be familiar with the two key language areas of the brain, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and damage to either of these areas is likely to cause aphasia, and that's an inability to understand or produce language. The endocrine system is another part of the body that is important to understand for psychology. The endocrine system has ductless glands that release hormones into the bloodstreams. And hormones are then picked up by different receptor sites, and they help regulate growth, metabolism, and some forms of behavior. And so when puberty kicks in, that is our hormones being released to send messages to the body that it's time to develop sexual characteristics. People also can have problems with their hormones, pituitary glands, thyroids, things that help us keep our body in a regulated state. And if those have issues, then we often need to have medical intervention to help regulate them. Part of our development is tied to evolution and heredity. Evolutionary psychology is related to this field because these psychologists study the ways in which adaptation and natural selection are connected with mental processes and behavior. And so the traits that are passed down through generations, we look at behaviors that are passed down through generations, we look at, and it helps us understand more how people and why people behave as they do. Starting with heredity, Heredity defines one's nature. This is based on biological structures and processes, and heredity refers to the biological transmission of traits that have evolved from generation to generation. So more commonly, what we look like, you can look at old pictures of your grandparents or great-grandparents, and you might be able to see a lot of similarities between what you look like and how they look. Genetics is a subfield of biology, and it studies heredity. So when we look at the bridge between psychology and biology, we're looking at how genetic transmission of traits cause certain patterns of behavior to evolve. So we might look at traits such as being very social, being shy, being dominant and aggressive, having leadership skills, being thrill seekers, and you might have somebody tell you, oh, you're just like your mom or you're just like your dad, and how you behave that way. And that's the study that psychologists look at because they want to see how those genes are passed from generation to generation and how they impact behavior. Genes are the most basic building blocks of heredity. It's estimated that the cells within the human body contain 20,000 to 25,000 genes. And genes are segments of chromosomes. So that means that chromosomes are made up of strings of genes. Now, each cell in the body contains 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. And chromosomes are large, complex molecules of DNA which have several chemical components. A group of scientists working together around the globe, and they were referred to as the Human Genome Project, learned that the sequencing of human beings' DNA consists of about 3 billion DNA sequences spread throughout their chromosomes. Some traits, such as eye color, are determined by a single pair of genes, whereas other traits, especially complex psychological traits, such as being social or aggressive, are thought to be polygenic, and that means that it's influenced by a combination of genes. Now, people's genetic code provides their genotype. That's their full genetic potential, and that's determined by the sequencing of the chemicals in the DNA. Now, one's phenotype is the manner in which the genetic code manifests itself, the way that it's expressed. And this can be expressed due to experiences or environmental circumstances. Now, we can refer to the genotype as one's nature, as our nature, yet the phenotype represents the interaction of nature and nurture, so the heredity and environmental influences. And this is what causes these genes to be expressed. We get 23 chromosomes from each parent, and our 23rd pair of chromosomes are our sex chromosomes, XX for female and XY for male. When people don't have the normal number of 46 chromosomes, remember that's 23 pairs, then physical and behavioral abnormalities may result. So, for example, most people with Down syndrome have an extra or a third chromosome on their 21st pair. One of the ways in which psychologists compare the presence of traits and behavior patterns in people who are biologically related or unrelated is through kinship studies. So parents and children have 50% of their genes in common, siblings as well, brothers and sisters. Aunts and uncles are related by blood, have a 25% overlap of genetics, and as the same as with nieces and nephews. And first cousins share actually 12.5% of their genes. So twin studies are great ways for psychologists to study traits and behavior. Studies have been done with identical twins or monozygotic twins, and also fraternal twins, dizygotic twins. And what twin studies do is they compare the presence of traits and behavior patterns in identical twins versus fraternal twins, and with other people to help determine how genetic factors are expressed. So if identical twins have a greater similarity on a trait or behavior pattern than fraternal twins, then we can say that trait is more the result of nature versus nurture. And what studies have found is that identical twins that were raised separately, they were adopted out separately, are about as similar as identical twins that were raised together in a lot of areas, including intelligence, personality, temperament, occupational choices, and hobbies. And so what that means is regardless of the environment in which they were raised, the identical twins still remain fairly similar in those areas. Adoption studies work in pretty similar ways. In adoption studies, they compare children who have been separated from their parents at an early age and raised in different environments. And then again, they look for similarities between the children and their adoptive parents and children and their biological parents. So when children are raised by adoptive parents, but they are more similar to the biological parents in a particular trait, then they can say that that trait is more strongly related to something that was innate, something for nature, versus something that was affected by the environment or nurture. So you can see how the field of biology and psychology is complex, but it is so much information that we can learn about behaviors and traits. And having a basic understanding of our biology is helpful in really understanding how personalities develop, how emotions are expressed, and understanding is it something related to our biology or is it something related to the environment. And that helps us in the future when we are working with people who are trying to improve or overcome issues, to understand is it something that has been affected by their environment and something that we can work with behavior, or if it's something that's more organic that needs some type of medical intervention. So again, I know this is a lot of information, and I do want you to study the text, study the exercises, review the videos so that you feel like you have a really good handle on this information before we move forward. Again, if you have any questions or need anything, just contact me, and have a great week.